when we were imagining the structure of these 2 days, we thought we would finish with a sort of open-ended conversation in which a kind of riff-raff of various participants in the conference, some of whom have given formal papers and others of whom have been asking questions from the audience, to perhaps reflect on the overall themes of the last 2 days. In particular, I think what is important in a kind of final session like this is for us to think about these 2 days in relationship to the bigger mission of the Multiple Modernisms project, and of course to try and pull some threads together so that the next time this mission meets, I think in Johannesburg next, right? Perhaps whatever we have gathered together can then be taken forward into the next stage of the project. As I've been listening, and I have to say it's been a real privilege to be a part of the audience for the last 2 days, I've been hearing a lot of tensions that are common seemingly to many of the presentations that we've heard. And I'm going to suggest to you that these tensions are embodied in the very title of our symposium, these words, Indigenous Modernisms. During the last 2 days, we've heard that under this rubric, we must include Russian and German entrepreneurs, Picasso and games of golf, a number of commercial art dealers and arts advisors, and of course a remarkable array of artists emerging out of some quite distinctive cultural, historical, and political contexts. So in this term we have a number of, I think all of the tensions of all of the papers are somehow embodied in this conjunction of these 2 words. And what I'm going to ask each of my panelists, who you'll notice are sitting in a very interesting conjunction of furniture supplied by Te Papa, which itself suggests the complexity of this term, modernism. Some people are sunk into some mid-century modernist furniture, which suggests why it's got quite a bad name in terms of comfort. And then in front we have some rather remarkable tables of indeterminate cultural origin. So what I'm going to do is ask each of my panelists to reflect for a moment on this term, Indigenous Modernisms, and to think about or speak about whether they find that an enabling or ultimately disabling term. Whether the, I mean, I'm going to actually start with Ruth. For example, in your talk, well, why not? You're the first keynote, so you now get to be the last keynote, so to speak. Oh, in your talk, for example, you expressed some anxiety about using a term like this because it might subsume and indeed homogenize some quite specific First Nations experiences and artistic practices. And yet at the end of your talk, you also said, with a certain amount of happiness, oh, and I notice already a certain amount of fellow travelling with the history of Maori modernism and the development of modernism here in New Zealand. So there's this kind of tension between a desire to accentuate the specificity of the particular story that you were telling, but then equally a desire to find links and common cause with similar stories being told in other parts of the world. So I'm wondering if at the end of the 2 days you're finding that this term Indigenous Modernisms is enabling or disabling as a kind of critical term.
Thanks, Jeff, and I feel an inadequate person to start this off, but I'll do my best. We've debated and debated this term from the start, so we're very happy to, I think all of us involved in the project, to air it again and to benefit from your insights. When we started the project, we knew that we wanted to focus on peoples who have been at the real far margin of the multiple modernism discussion. Because as many speakers have already said, Latin American modernisms, Eastern European modernisms, South Asian modernisms have been addressed and are, to a limited degree, being acknowledged and incorporated into major art exhibition programs, etc. But the modernisms of peoples who have been colonized and who declare themselves to be indigenous peoples in settler societies have still not, we think, maybe people will disagree, really been acknowledged, recognized as belonging to our time. So the term indigenous, we recognize, is not good for everybody. And in the publications we're thinking about, we've toyed with the notion of indigenous and colonized people, et cetera. If Betsy will forgive me, I will also offer something that the two of us have come up with together in formulating our first edited volume, which is in preparation. And that is to say, the group of people whose 20th century arts we want to talk about are people who used to be subsumed within the term primitive, and then it was replaced by Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And that's a category which is still out there. Those peoples tend to get lumped together. They're the peoples whose arts were collected only by ethnology museums, and Nick Thomas gave us a great talk the other night about that. And it is a marked category because it's been excluded. So our effort to say, no, we are all in modernity together, and these are art traditions that have negotiated modernity in many, many ways, and that looking at them in a comparative manner can reveal both the common patterns that they exhibit, largely, partly because of their fate as colonized peoples during the 20th century, also because of their particular relationships to land in settler societies, and because of this discursive tradition of AOA, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, which, at least in North America, you will go to any big art museum, and there will be a section of it which still segregates these arts. So I'll give you one more example, then I'll let everyone else talk. Boston's Museum of Fine Arts redid its American wing a few years ago, and it has 4 floors, and in the basement is the 17th century, which is the earliest period of settlement. That is where the Native American art is displayed, and the pre-Columbian art. You move on up through it, and the top floor, you will find African American art incorporated. The whole thing makes absolutely no sense at all, and it's an example of this kind. And then you'll find African art elsewhere in its little room, and in Pacific arts elsewhere in its little room. There is a real problem, as you and I, Jeff, have talked about in another context, with our effort to create a world art history if we keep ghettoizing these traditions and not looking at them as interrelated and as equivalent and equal to each other. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but others should now have their chance.
Why don't I pass the baton on to Chika next? So is this word Indigenous Modernism an improvement on AOA or previous designations? Does it open up different kinds of questions, allow different kinds of histories to be written?
For sure, it does open up the conversation because it includes modernism, which is already a fraught term in itself, even though at least at some point, scholars thought they knew what it meant. But increasingly, there's a sense that it's become even more intractable as a term. And so the notion of indigenous modernisms raises questions. Now, that's a good thing for subjects that no one bothered to ask any questions of. Simply put them in a corner of the museum and let people look at them. There were no debates, there were no conversations of the type that generated all the books and stuff on modern Euro-American artists. So the fact that this project describes the same subjects, the same material that have been consigned to the AOA sections of global art museums, by bringing it to the fore and suggesting, with the temerity of, suggesting that this is modernism. I think it's a productive argument and a productive debate that we can have on the basis that we are being asked to reflect on this material as an aspect of this widening vista of the modern. So in that sense, yes, it's a productive thing to do. But at the same time, since we have then convened a forum to debate, then it's time to actually say, okay, now that we are sort of agreeing.
Now it's time to abandon it, now that we've accepted it?
Perhaps so. But the question, of course, is, for me, and this is why yesterday when Terry asked about Georgina Baya and Indigenous Modernism, and I said, I'm not sure what that means. But I could only do that in the context of this forum, right? Because we've come to talk about it. If it was in a different forum, I probably will have a different response. Because now it's time to actually get to business, right? In sharpening the tools that we're going to bring to bear on the subjects of our interest. And so the reference that Ruth was making, and there's this particular example of the Met and the artist that I was speaking about yesterday, Ella Natsui, whose work, the Dusasa 2, that is in the Met collection. He has another work also in the Met collection that came into the collection first. And that is a smaller version of the monumental metal works. That is in the African collection. And so
I've seen it exhibited there.
Yeah, so it's in the AOA collection.
Is this work also exhibited in the contemporary wing?
That's precisely what I'm saying. So the first work that entered the Met was in the AOA section. And then he goes to Venice, becomes contemporary, and then they acquired his work and put it, where monumental, serious, contemporary artists are, installed or presented. So his inscription into that museum presents a dilemma for the ways that not just institutions, but also, the scholarship that supports these institutions, the curatorial frameworks and so forth, how they operate. What do you then do with an artist like that? He becomes like this schizophrenic character who is African, but who is contemporary. And just the spatial boundaries between the two works from the same artist already suggests the fraught nature of these forms of classifications, including that, Indigenous Modernism. So we can return to this later because there's so much to say, but I think that Indigenous Modernism at the first go, yes, it's a good thing to present an idea that is worth talking about. But once we agree that it's worth talking about, then we get down to serious business.
In a minute, I'll come back and you can tell me what term you prefer then.
Sure.
Tina, is it possible that the real radicality of the term then is actually in the final S, this notion of modernisms? Because as I've been listening to papers, one of the things that has struck me, and I'm sure most people have sat through the whole 2 days, is that under that rubric we've seen headrests, we've seen realist pencil drawing portraits, as well as, of course, the kind of work that perhaps most academically trained art historians tend to privilege, which is work that is gravitated towards abstraction and high modernism. Is the real innovation here to actually multiply modernism and look at a whole range of different kinds of objects?
I don't know if I'll answer your question absolutely directly. And I've got two thoughts, and I don't know if I can offer both of them in the short time I have available to me.
2 words, Indigenous Modernism, so you can have 2 thoughts.
I can have 2 thoughts. And I should say that I'm outside of your project, that I'm a very interested observer, and what I'd like to offer a kind of a perception of some edges or some outsides to the project, because this notion of offering a more nuanced, deeper, richer histories of modernisms as they've taken place in these marginal places is vital and important, and I value it enormously. But I wonder if, my first point, I wonder if you are still working on the inside of something. In the first instance, it seems to me that the team is operating within the terms of academia and museum culture. And I think my first observation is that there is a third term to that, which is the art world. And I'd like to acknowledge the artists who are in the audience. And in fact, Para actually mentioned this world that he's in, which is the art world, which is, to some extent, I think, a kind of an outside to the debates that we're undertaking here. Because there's stuff that goes on out there that can't be pinned down by the careful scholarly work that we're doing. In particular, I'd like to invoke an example. We've just had a major art prize, the Walters Art Prize, and one of the works in this was by a Tongan artist, Kaliso Laiti Uhila, which was a performance work that actually generated a huge amount of really important debate. Interestingly, that debate took place on blogs and websites rather than to a lesser extent in publications. It was controversial because he spent the 3 months of the exhibition living rough on the streets. And what interested me about the debates was the extent to which contemporary art world people would pigeonhole it in relation to a history of performance art, and how he was also thought about in terms of his own Tongan traditions. And one of the richest debates that took place was actually a particular person who started to draw analogies within Tongan culture to the character of the heretic who lived outside of society and critiqued Tongan high culture. Now, my real point is not, I thought that was an immensely rich and interesting debate that took place that really nuanced an understanding of his practice, and I was delighted with it. But one of the commentators on one of the blogs came back and said, hang on a minute, this might be of interest to art historians, but what we're dealing with here is a work that's playing out in what he called the situation, and I must actually get the terminology right, he called it the hyper institutionalization of art at this moment. And I'll quote him here, I'm quoting, but are we not tired, exhausted even, by all this tracking down and tracing, by all these search engine methodologies, this institutionally instigated research into artistic models and context of tradition? And he goes on to say, isn't all of this a kind of capturing and taming, a capture of art by elites, a taming of artists for careerism and professionalization? Now, I didn't entirely agree with him, but I thought he had a point. And my point is that, how do we contend with the realities of the art world today, of the spectacularization of culture, the continuing exoticization of difference, and how does this project actually address that? My other very quick point about the plural nature of this term, modernisms, is a degree of perplexity and discomfort, which is probably one I deserve, which is to do with my own situation as a Pākehā New Zealand art historian and curator, and my sense of invisibility in these debates, because I'm incredibly proud and interested to hear Anna Marie White and Ngahi Raka talking from their perspectives. And I completely respect the way in which they are distinguishing their histories for themselves. In a sense, I'm not going to let go of my sense of history unfolding as a series of ruptures and losses and redemptions and problems, because I think white art historians and white artists and white culture also needs to be anthropologized. We need to be understood. And also our difference also needs to be acknowledged. And I mean my difference in relation to the art world beyond our shores, because No one's interested in New Zealand art outside of New Zealand. And yet what we have here is actually very interesting. And it's interesting because of the cultural dialogue and dissonance between the cultures, across the cultures. It's, you know, I don't want to take anything away from the important work that needs to be done on Māori modernism or Māori art history, but I also recognise that there are other histories of art that have unfolded in this country that inflect on world art history, and I think there's a great deal of flattening going on, a recolonisation that's going on out in the art world at large, which we have to be cognizant of and maybe put a stake in the ground for a kind of art history that is nuanced in terms of place and local histories, but one that is complex enough to allow Pākehā to be a term that has some specific meaning.
Thanks, Tim. All right, Shane, you're next up. The word flattening was just used. The word flattening was just used, and I think Tina was mostly thinking of it in terms of her and my practice, you know, as historians and curators and so on. But I wonder if you find terms like this enabling or disabling as a practicing artist. You said something. You reflected a little bit on the Maori modernism box during your conversation, but what about this bigger term?
Yeah, I actually feel quite uncomfortable with both of those words, actually.
Yeah.
But
can you just say, you know, where
well, because I'm neither. Well, I mean, I suppose I'm indigenous, but I'm not a traditional Maori maker of artwork. Bits and pieces of my practice touch on tradition and customary practice. But I suppose neither am I sort of like a pure modernist, even though I went to a Western art school. So I'm kind of nowhere really in some senses of the word, but of the words.
Do you think there are artists out there that the term aptly applies to, or do you think all artists might feel that they're somehow between those words?
Well, I'm not sure. I haven't really spoken to a lot of people about it, but I do know that, I mean, in terms of these terms, or in terms of the things that one makes, I do sort of, one of the things I do think about a lot is the notion of loss. Especially when you're trying to, you feel you're doing things that are new, you feel that you're sort of challenging certain kinds of, not expectations, but sort of boundaries. But I would hope that a Maori audience or a Maori academic or my peers would actually give me some kind of critique based on the things that one does. And so I think in that sense, you know, if I'm looking at this notion of modernisms, I think that's a kind of an interesting sort of debate that's almost in-house. But it was interesting listening to Anne-Marie discuss Saffron's work, because I think the way that she sort of presented it, even though she, well, what was interesting for me is that I could walk into that show and spectate, critique, and kind of reflect on that show purely as a person who has some kind of modernist background or comes from outside of the understandings of the makings of that work and have a comment to make about it. On the other hand, if I was someone from Tūhoe who understood those narratives, I'd have a very sort of direct in-way to actually comprehend that work. So I kind of like it that, you know, the possibilities of interpretation are kind of open, and I think actually most probably Saffron's most probably aware of that, is that sort of double take on things. I'd like to think that my own work's actually about that as well. So, but I do think there's you know, I don't like to, I think one gets in trouble when we sort of narrow too quickly what certain things are in terms of definitions. And I know that's, you know, what you guys kind of exist for.
It's our stock in trade.
And of course, I think, you know, from an artist's point of view, we actually need that dialogue. We do need it, but sometimes I feel it's a wee bit like a sledgehammer. to say, bang, this is basically how it is at the moment, where in actual fact I know that it's actually not that set in concrete. So that it's kind of like it's a kind of these are very sort of fluid definitions. Yeah.
Elizabeth, I think both Shane and Chika have suggested that while they remain fluid, they're productive, but as they congeal, they become less so. Is this the time to begin to debate new terms? Do we already have some terms, that we should be now moving on to? What do you think about this term, Indigenous Modernisms?
I think for someone who's worked her whole life in African situations, particularly French colonial situations, I felt very uncomfortable with the term at first, not really knowing actually how to apply it at all to the histories of peoples and artists that I've worked with. They never used the term themselves. There are a lot of other terms that were used that I think would perhaps in some ways have parallels to a lot of the meanings that have been shared here. But I think as a result of that, it has been productive to have to sort of come up against a term that obviously in some ways has grouped, the structures of the art world had grouped all these peoples together when in fact they have very different ways of thinking about themselves and their histories. And I guess, so I still sit quite uncomfortably with the indigeneity idea. I think certainly in the areas that I've worked in, it's been much more about layers of cosmopolitanism. And when indigeneity comes up, it is often used. It's a historically constructed notion used for very specific political or social reasons. But as far as modernism goes, I also we've struggled with that. We've often, in fact, I think we often forget what we're using because we refer to it often as modernities and not modernisms. So.
I've been calling it multiple modernities myself.
And
then I suddenly,
that was sort of, I don't know that there was a moment where we actually decided it had to be, it is not meant to be a solidifying or gelling set of terms. I would say that I do, for me, the more interesting word there is histories, because I think it's important to think about when there have been artists in different locations who have been left out of various histories, institutional histories and so forth, who actually have chosen to use that term modernism, and why. And also how, from our contemporary standpoint, we then, I guess, think about why they used it and also acknowledge that they used it. Because there are moments where, I know at one point when I was working in Senegal, I was working with a group that spoke about their vanguardism and their avant-gardism. And I've had various critics come back and say, well, she's imposing a Western framework on it. Yes, I know that I am, and I think everyone working in this area needs to be sensitive to that. But they also chose that word, and they were engaged very specifically, historically speaking, in a very cosmopolitan manner, with avant-gardes around the world as they were forming their own senses of modernism. And they were calling it that. So I guess, for me, I don't want to cling to modernism, and as I was sort of saying in my talk here, there's a lot of strange. I pick up on your spectacularization and kind of recolonization idea going on around modernism now. That was sort of what prompted me to think about retro-modernism. But I also think that we need to just be really vigilant about listening to the history, listening to the voices of these histories that we encounter, and not just dismiss it as something that's simply imposed, but actually sometimes chosen.
Terry, of course, you have a long record as a historian of modern art and international modern art, and you're also a man who likes to debate terms.
Yep.
So I'm wondering how effective you find this one, not just in terms of the debates within this group, but what lessons might it have, or what could be drawn from it in terms of a broader history of modern art?
Right. Okay, so Shane, this is like a studio for art historians. Conference is our studio. It's our laboratory. It's where we actually have a chance to debate terms, not just with ourselves, but with other people. And so at a conference, the debate in a conference is not the public. It's not public discourse, and it's not meant to constrain people. in other situations, it can be a little more constraining. So on the terms, so modernism, if I was to quote from the Dictionary of Art from 1998, when someone who's actually sitting right here wrote that modernism is artistic form, strategies and content that manifests not only close but essential connections to social modernity, that's to say to the forces of modernization and the experiential worlds that they create and in fact shapes the art. Now I quibble with the idea of essential, but I really meant that in a strong sense. I meant a definitive relationship to all those. So at that point, during the postmodern era, I was writing about modernism as that kind of relation. There's a strong sense in the word modernist that brings up the sense of being extremely modern, totally committed to modern art as a practice and the tradition of modernist innovation, to the avant-garde and so on. That's a very strong sense if you add "ist" to something. But there's also a more general usage in public discourse. If you add "ist," it means like something. I mean, it's a weak version. It can be, it's sort of modern, it's in the direction of modern. And unfortunately, the strong sense has tended to attach to modern art practice in Europe and America, and the weaker sense has tended, particularly from European American perspectives, to attach to modern art produced elsewhere. In fact, the market, market for auction houses, particularly for African art, until very recently had no category for modern art. You had traditional and then you had contemporary, right? It's as if people who were not modern could never produce a modern art. That was the perspective. And clearly the whole enterprise that this is part of a massive shift in consciousness against that viewpoint. But it does remain a question, for me a really burning question is, why should the word modern be the locus of everything that's valuable and everything towards which we all aspire, artists everywhere in any part of the world? And why, if you have to have another term, does it have to be traditional, right? Or customary, or, you know. Why does it have to be one term? Why can't it be a set of terms? I'll come back to that in a second. Indigeneity is another one. Indigeneity sounds like it's absolutely the most fundamental term and about something that is the most fundamental in the world. But it's a Latinate term and it means self-generation. Genus indi, independent generation. It's to actually create yourself, generate yourself, and have that capacity, which is clearly something that is primarily the possession originally of the first peoples in the world. But most peoples in the world are settlers in some sense, and they generate their own indigeneity over time, over a long time afterwards. And that applies to a lot of the people we've been speaking about. So the idea of a kind of native is a term implied from outside an indigenous situation. So I think the term indigeneity is a strong term, but it's an open term. Both the terms, modernism and indigeneity, are processual terms. They're about processes, not about fixed entities. And they both have a tendency towards autonomy, towards self-generation and originating themselves. The difference is that indigenous peoples were the first self-generators, right? And the most basic, and the generators who are older and generate deeper states of being that living through the modern present, the present of settler peoples, and hopefully will outlast our era, if you like. Indigeneity can perhaps modernize itself from within, and art might be an end to that purpose. But the question is, do indigenous peoples and cultures not want to indigenize the whole society in which they're in, or just part of it? I mean, how big is the negotiation? Or is it about a kind of survival? And so, in a certain way, the indigenization of contemporary art around the world is in fact occurring, which is why I asked the question about Georgina Beyer, We could go all the way up to Untitled as an indigenized, contemporary artist. So, in other words, it doesn't necessarily have to be, you don't have to be indigenous to produce indigenous art in this regard, if we're going to stay with these terms. So you see what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to relativize, but not distribute these terms. They all are specific and they're all kind of limited.
Terry, if you, for example, were to include Imants Tillers under this rubric.
No, not this one. It's not a modernist. Or it's actually probably it's a remodernist actually. And
well, whatever. But Chika's, I think, was suggesting that this term, if it has any purchase at all, its purchase is to open up areas that have been undervalued, understudied, suppressed. If we start to, as you're doing here, broaden it back out, doesn't it lose precisely the purchase that made it useful in the first place, even if he's about to supersede it? Chika, do you want to?
Yeah. I think Terry, there's a
stirring over here.
There's a kind of paradox to what you're suggesting. In the first instance about modernism, right? Yeah. You have a problem with expanding it, right, to fit in everything, right? But then you seem to want the indigeneity to be expanded, right? So is modernism resistant to being expanded, whereas indigeneity is the more flexible one? Yeah, so that's
could be.
That's something to think about. But I think that on the question of modernism, that much of what generated the conversation around this project is not so much that this is a project that looks at art in the present as such, but quite importantly, the art that has slipped, that had fallen through the historical memory of art history. Right. And I think that the point that Terry made about the auction houses is illustrative of that. That you could have, and you still do have, these rubrics. African art, which is the masks and whatever the modernists were fascinated with. And then there's contemporary, which is the one that sells well. And, is seen across biennials and so forth. But the work of the generation that came before the so-called contemporary, no one knows about them. No one reads about them. It's as if the contemporary African artist just emerged out of nowhere. Right. And so this idea of something new out of Africa that's so old in the Western imagination still follows like a wondrous shadow on, these contemporary artists that just seem to have come from out of nowhere. I think the idea of, returning to modernism for this project is to look back at where are these artists coming from, what contexts that are not simply those of art schools, European-style art schools that they must have attended and then became contemporary. Whereas there are at least 3 generations of artists prior to this moment that has escaped our interest. So I think that it's not that we are, at least the way I understand it, that this project is trying to declare contemporary artists working in the present, as modernists or as modern artists or whatever one term that one could use. But to look at this period in history that art historians have not paid attention to, and we're calling attention to that moment.
Like the 50s and 60s in particular.
Yes.
We've got about half an hour to go. We're not going to end our conversation here, but I'm just warning you, I'm about to turn to the audience. If whoever's sitting closest to the microphones wouldn't mind becoming responsible for them, please start thinking of questions and comments of your own, either about this term that we're currently debating or about any other issue that might have come up during the last 2 days, or anything that the panelists have said thus far. This is the chance for the audience to speak. So gather your thoughts, your remaining energies, and please start formulating questions. Terry, do you want to make a comeback on this?
I think it's fascinating. In your talk, to me, El Enetsu's earlier work was a modern, not necessarily modernist, but a modern adjustment working and so on and so forth. But the breakthrough work, what I call breakthrough work, the hanging pieces, are absolutely a contemporary art. So in the case of one artist, literally, it's possible. If the terms make any sense, they can be applied to one artist in different parts of his career.
Can you just describe quickly why the so-called cloths are the breakthrough work and somehow distinctive from the work that came the year before?
Because they transform art altogether, okay?
Is that just a matter of exposure? Because honestly, the revelation for me was to actually see that previous work. I'd heard that he'd made things before them, but I'd never seen them. And I mean,
well, they're interesting.
I'm in the scene and I've never seen them.
They're interesting, but in my read, they're works that are parallel to the kind of efforts by a lot of artists in circumstances where they were actually making a modern kind of art that was not necessarily modernist, in many senses, but it was a sufficient basis for him to produce this break. It's exceptional. It's like Emily and Warry in terms of Australia. Within the structure of what we're talking about, it's possible for individual artists to produce a singularity. I mean, a singular event that doesn't necessarily follow from the great categories we're talking about. Right?
I'm just not convinced, but we'll open up to the audience that singular event is to be found in the art or in the market and its response to the art. But that's a debate we can continue.
One comes from the other. But
how about we hear from our audience? Who's got a question or a comment, either about the term Indigenous Modernisms or any of the other issues that have come up over the last 2 days?
Can I just ask a question of Chika? You talked yesterday about post-colonial modernisms and the post-colonial contemporary. Was that a term that you bandied around as a framing device?
You always struggle to name something in order to make it legible, even if that also confounds what you're trying to describe. But I think I have a clear sense of what I mean by post-colonial modernism, and I try to describe them, in terms of its alignment with decolonization and nationalist project that was about sovereignty, and the ways in which formal experimentation was tied to relationship with emerging traditions that is also tied to, this boundless sense of infinite possibilities. These were, three kinds of sensibilities that I associate with the kind of work that emerged in the 50s and 60s that I describe as post-colonial modernism, and also precisely because this was happening during this period of decolonization. And so that's fairly clear in my head, rightly or wrongly, what I mean by post-colonial modernism. But when it comes to the contemporary, the only thing I offer in terms of how to think of the difference is that what happened to that generation of artists who are actually the ones that get, that slipped through, perhaps because of the uncomfortable association, at least from the international market, between this art and nationalism. And so it's something, modern art is not supposed to be about politics and nationalism and so forth. But that's something we can
what else is it about, anyway?
Yeah, but the contemporary, what I tend to think of as the contemporary artistic moment, began to happen at the moment these, euphoria of independence began to unravel. And artists, because if you look at the generation that I'm talking about, they hardly were critical of the decolonization process or the nationalist project. But at the moment when the euphoria of independence began to wear out, the art began to be self-critical, of the nation, of the context of their production. So I think that that's what, for me, defines the contemporary as different from the modern. That's do I tend to think about the difference between the two.
Ian, you like to ask a question? Could somebody give him a microphone, please?
Yeah, I don't know who first used the term, Indigenous Modernism, but I remember well when I first used it. And it was in a review of an exhibition of Kuninku bark painting. That must have been over 10 years ago at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and it wasn't so much a history of Kuninku painting, but it displayed painting from about 1912 up until about 2000. And I suppose I thought that there could have been written a history of a particular group of artists. It could have been historicised, and if it had been historicised, it would have been a little like a history of modern art, or a history of 20th century Kuninku art. And I called it Indigenous Modernism because, just like Terry's definition, I was thinking modernism is a critical response to modernity. In this case, it was a critical response to the first art, which was made in 1912 when a buffalo hunter set up a farm and an anthropologist came along, and there was a sort of a modernity created there. Then the missions came, and then the art centre came. So there are all these different types of modernities that were established in and around this particular part of West Arnhem Land. Right. And you could look at the art and the way it had changed as a response to those different modernities. And the thing that I liked about the term, that I thought was clever about the term Indigenous Modernism, is that the term was an oxymoron, in that our definition of modernism excluded Indigenous, and therefore putting these two words together, it became a sort of self-critical term. And the other thing I liked about it...
Does it still have that capacity, Ian, is the question? Do you think it still has that capacity?
I'm not sure. But the other thing I liked about the term was that I felt that it gave some agency to, in this case, the Indigenous artists who were still sort of being classified. I mean, the exhibition was uncertain as to where to put them, as to whether it was Aboriginal art or primitive art or whatever. So this idea of an oxymoron, of a sort of critique of what modernism was and of agency, were very important to me in how I sort of understood the purpose of that term. But I was, at that time, reading this stuff that was coming about multiple modernisms. That's where I got the idea from. And I don't know, any other critic here has any story about how they may have first used or conceived the term?
Shane?
Can I, this thing, I suppose the upshot, the bottom line for me is, Indigenous Modernisms. Is there a way that what we do in our localities, in our places, is it going to add to the definition of what art is? That's what it comes down to. Yeah. And I'd like to think that it does, because I know that there's some pretty shit-hot art made in this country that's got some, has different histories to it. And I think it can stand up alongside some of the great modernist works, or even actually some of the great Renaissance works. So I was sort of wondering, for me, I think that's what I'm interested in.
Matt, I think you've got the microphone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I just wanted to sort of give a few impressions that I've got, and some of them may be misimpressions, given the nature of the 20-minute conference paper and the sort of the limitations and the sort of and to go into all those nuanced details. One impression that I've got, and Ruth clarified this a little bit, was that when we're talking about Indigenous, we're talking about non-Western Indigenous cultures. But as I think Terry and others have sort of implied, we have to remember that Europeans are Indigenous to Europe, and that high modernism, as we sort of often talk about it, is really just another indigenous modernism. If we don't acknowledge that, I think the risk is that we actually reinforce that Eurocentric nature, that it is the global, it is the thing to which all others are different. And I think there's an opportunity in what Tina mentioned when she said we need to take a sort of anthropological, ethnographic approach to, say, Pakeha art as well as Maori art. We also need to, I think, or can benefit from taking that same approach to a traditional modernism, as we consider it, as a European indigenous modernism. I felt that one tendency was, and it's an easy trap to fall into, and this is once again just my impression, that although modernism was talked about in a great deal, there was a tendency to sort of homogenize traditional, European modernism as a monolithic, uncomplicated single entity with common features such as a linear conception of time. I think of someone, say, like Walter Benjamin's On the Concept of History, as a Western modernist thinker who counters that assumption, who suggests another approach or another relationship to time, which is much more in keeping with the sort of circular, backwards-facing view of time. And you might also think of the transgressions of Dada or Duchamp or Surrealism. Modernism is not a simple thing to confine, and when I'm saying modernism, I'm talking about that traditional narrative of modernism. It tends to become a bit of a straw figure.
So do you think the S is sufficient to encompass the
it just needs to be
modernism?
applied to traditional modernisms. It needs to be, the S needs to be grafted on not just the modernisms outside of Europe, but also to that European modernism. And I just wanted to finish with a final thought, which kind of harks back to Ruth's comment about the Mobius strip and modernism and primitivism. And there's often this tendency to think of primitivism as a pejorative term and a problematic one. I think it's definitely problematic, but it doesn't have to be pejorative. If you look at the etymology of the word, an original cause, the thing from which something is derived, not secondary. The defining quality of primitivism is originality, and that is also often the quality that we ascribe most closely with modernism. So in that sense, that Mobius strip metaphor is very appropriate. And if we adopt this sort of non-Western view of going into the future with our back turned to the past, what's the furthest thing from the moment that we're in? What's the most advanced? What's the most avant-garde? It's actually the earliest. So there's a way in which that circularity can be applied to avant-garde, not as ahead of time, but as the most advanced from our own position.
Thanks, man.
Jeff, can I
you want to respond to that, Ruth?
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think it's very important in this discussion to distinguish modern from modernist and to distinguish social primitivism or sociological primitivism from aesthetic primitivism. Because one of the purposes of this whole project has been to acknowledge the shared modernity of everybody, which I think most of us would agree. I don't know if anyone would disagree that there has been a world system that's economic, technological, and mobile for centuries. And colonialism brought everybody into this system, and it was co-constituted by all the people who were participating in it. But we all know that evolutionist theory, that was the pernicious ideology of colonialism, defined the colonized people as primitives and put them in a certain category. And that sociological primitivism was a terrific pejorative that justified all kinds of evils. And then you get art people coming along in the early 20th century, objecting to many aspects of Western modernity and inventing aesthetic primitivism as a good thing, as a return to origins, as an improvement on the academic classical tradition of the West. And then they celebrate the arts of these sociologically, disadvantaged people as good. All those contradictions have been debated and illuminated. But what happens in the mid-20th century with these arts that we are looking at is a negotiation of those contradictions, which occurs in historical contingent terms, and which I think everybody has been saying that all along, Chika, Betsy, everybody, is that our project is an attempt to look at that period, we really welcomed and wanted to have this conference address the contemporary in relation to that history. But really what we're looking at is the historical basis for the contemporary and to promote an analysis of it which makes a distinction between modernity, modernism as a parochial European tradition which has been elevated to a universal, standard, but which has been reinvented multiple times all over the place in perfectly authentic ways. I won't go on anymore, but...
Terry's got a brief...
Thanks, Terry. So on that point, and it's something occurred to me listening to this debate in an earlier version in Munich, was we definitely need new terms, not necessarily for the whole picture, because this is a very big picture art historiographical pair of terms, but terms to actually pinpoint what is it that this, what was originated in artistic terms, as Shane puts it, by artists who were in the position of wanting to be modern and to become modern in the later 20th century. And to me, the distinctive thing that is shared by many artists in many of these situations is something that I build on a term that Bernard Smith introduced when he was writing about Sidney Nolan's idea of the Ned Kelly mask, which Nolan once told me was, well, that's of course Malevich in the Australian desert. What else is it? That's what it can. So, in other words, the bringing together of icons from two quite different cultural settings in such a way as that it generates a kind of iconomorphy, a kind of continuous production of a possible set of images and icons that have actually come from two cultures and transcend the two cultures and bring them into conversation with each other. And I've seen that in El Salahi, I've seen it in artist after Hoteri. I mean, artist after artist who we've looked at have been in a condition of having to, as it were, operate between at least two different cultural settings and had the skill and the insight and the ability to pick out elements, not randomly, but just pick out the ones that when you do fuse them, and not just hybrids and sit there, but actually generate new imagery and keep on doing it for a long time. And that's, I think, what is that's the overall invention of this body of artists. That you can't say it's not the predominant way you describe a lot of work in Europe and America, although it does apply to some artists. But okay, that's a comment.
Can I just make a comment? Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on something that Ruth has been saying, and also some of your comments. I think, while I agree with Chika about his framing of post-colonial modernism, and certainly the work I did in Senegal was also at this moment of decolonization, I think it's also important for this project, and certainly of what I know of the individual projects that are making up the larger project, for us to also not necessarily pin it just to mid-century and just to the post-colonial, which might answer a little bit of this question of, why are we treating European modernism just as such, as a general term? Because a lot of these modernisms that emerge post-World War II have deeper roots in, the 20th century, and many of these artists and intellectuals are circulating and meeting each other and engaged in creating what we understand to be European modernism. And, Coban and Mercer and all these guys have already talked about this. We have this longer history of discussions that don't just start at mid-century, and I think all of us in our work are aware of that we should have a kind of floating, like that idea, this idea of a sort of a more capacious understanding of those parameters of the terms and the historical markers. I'm thinking in my own case, I did work on Senegalese modernism, and Senghor was, active in the 30s in Paris, and was absolutely a modernist. He was engaged in a modernist project. It didn't just start in 1960. So I think I just wanted to sort of add that I think even though we are thinking we're examining sort of the lost years, that those borders should remain rather
fluid.
Yeah.
Richard?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things in regard to the Indigenous modernism, Joe, and getting to maybe something that Ian said, you know, like, it appears to me that you're looking at to make up new words, new terminology to go in all your books.
We hope so, anyway.
You're like, well, I can come up with 2 words to describe the situation really well. You know, Darky's Corner. Okay, that's where we are. You look, and if we look at the art world as it really is, you know, like, it's a massive cock forest, and it's a white cock forest. Okay, so you know, that's where we're at now. For me, this is really exciting. This gives agency to the heroes of this modern era, and these modernisms, you know, like. Well, there's just one actually, you know, like, and it happened all around the world. It's just that the white people haven't got around to recognising that. But there's just that sort of thing. So, like, for me, I was hoping that I'd come here and hear some discussions and some discourses, coming from these colonised countries. You know, like we're a big percentage of the world's population nowadays. You know, like, and surely, in fact, there's something interesting going on in all these places. You know? So I was hoping to get something like that.
And just you didn't feel you did, Richard. You didn't feel you did get that, something like that.
Pardon?
You didn't feel that you did get something like that.
Well, it's not over yet, is it?
Well, we got 10 minutes.
Perhaps I
Sarah.
could pick up on that, because I think what I've been wondering is, and this is directed, I guess, more at the core group involved in the Multiple Modernities or Multiple Modernisms project, is who is your audience and who are you doing this for? And I'm just conscious of all the people in the audience and the fact that, you know, yours is an itinerant project. But I do wonder what is kind of going to be given back to the various communities.
Ruth, why don't you pick that up as one of the founders of the group?
My first statement is students. What we want to do, I don't know if everyone will agree with me, and they should say if not, but my thought has always been, I would like students, whether they're in high school or in university or wherever they are, when they read the history of modernism, they read it in this broad, inclusive, comprehensive way, and that Australian Aboriginal modernists and Inuit modernists and Nigerian, you know, that everybody is in there in an even-handed way. So we're going to have a workshop tomorrow, and then everyone that's been speaking is going to have to put their money where their mouth is, because we want to produce a series of edited volumes. The first one has been accepted and is in production from our first conference, which will provide accessible histories of the modern in all sorts of places and contexts. And that's not available now. I think a number of us have been trying to teach this field, and certainly many people who've been at this conference have written wonderfully helpful things that we've been using. But it's actually still hard to get hold of these books when you're in Canada, or if you're in, you know, I'm sure our stuff's not easily available here, and, you know, so that's what I would say. The second audience, I would say we'd like to reach our museum audiences, and through promoting the exhibition and collection in some cases of this work. But others should respond too, if you agree.
I just would add that we did have at one point the dream of a digitization project that would also make images that through our own research, much more available to a wider audience, but that didn't get funded. So.
Yeah, I just want to chuck something into the cauldron here. And
Glad you think it's a cauldron. We're already feeling flattered.
It's a cauldron, yeah. And that's nature, nurture, and hijack.
Was that hydrogen was the last one?
Hijack.
Hijack.
Oh, hijack.
Somewhere along the line, everybody starts out.
Get those words.
Everyone. That's a known fact. Everyone's in the same boat. And I'm talking about at kids level, as I've mentioned before, all around the world, people come at an issue in the same way. The nurture takes over somewhere along the line. Hijack takes over, because those people who are pretty much all the same in their endeavours are now taken over by their cultures. They're hijacked by their cultures. For instance, I've just, Tina, you're talking about a Indigenous Pākehā. We've got Indigenous Māori, of course, and we've got Indigenous everything else. So somewhere, those people are taken over by their own cultures. They're hijacked. Now, the thing that Ralph, talking about Ralph before, is he didn't classify himself as a Maori artist. He was Maori, but he was making art. He grew up in that world. He was in nature. He was the same as everyone else. And we've got people who were the same as everyone else, some who became artists and others who became other things. But the art world has hijacked its own people. Maoris are trying to hijack us, you know, to become...
I wonder if this project is a kind of attempt at a re-hijacking then.
Yeah, well, what I'm trying to say is that we all start out at a level all the same, but along the way we become part of our own culture, or our cultures start to take over and absorb us into the realm. If the artists can stay true, we don't have any of this. We wouldn't have any of it. So Indigenous Modernism, all those sorts of things don't really matter to the artist who is true to their own self. Thank you.
Thank you. I did see the microphone is at the back there somewhere.
Kia ora everybody, just taking over from that too, because throughout this I've been wondering, you know, the role of the artist here has been very much relegated to a conservation role in what I'm looking at in my experience of these 2 days. But I was just, you know, not knowing much about the project, but I'm just really hoping that the multiplicity of voices can be represented, you know, not just through the academy and not just through a very sort of particular voice. Like, I really enjoyed a lot of the conversation, but I would have liked to have seen a lot of the art practitioners been given a chance to take part in the critical theory, not just as in a concert, you know, having a little chat on the couch sort of thing. And I feel that by layering up these voices, that you're actually adding more to the toolbox that you can dip into with these conversations is the word I was trying to look for here, and that to really allow that voice in, because it is at a particular stream and a very privileged frame that this is inhabiting. So when I first saw Indigenous, you know, my expectations definitely went one way, and the modernism side is, you know, not particularly au fait. I'm an art practitioner. I work with museums, but I haven't come from an art historical line. So a lot of that theory goes over my head. But I know that I have contributed internationally to projects, and that was because people like Cambridge and Nicholas have let my voice sit at an even platform as the higher, more privileged frame of the academic voice. So I suppose just my point in with that is that I've really enjoyed, I've got a lot out of it. I've got to hear some of my work being reframed and repositioned in a particular vernacular, which is, you know, a privileged place, and it was wonderful because at the time when the Pacific Sisters were enacting, or when we're just being the artists, there's a lot of frames that were put on us, and we were never allowed to actually declare what we were. And when people finally started to let our voice into that intellectual framework, it, for me, became a little bit more interesting because they were allowing in different voices, and we've all got different roles, so I never kind of see it as a replacement for the academic voice, but it's definitely a different role. But I think it's a very valid and a very important role that needs to sit side by side, not down on the couch, but also up on that podium as well. So I suppose that's just my comment of my experience for the last 2 days. That's been a very, very enjoyable and very stimulating 2 days. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your contribution.
That's a good wrap.
We've unfortunately run out of conversational time, so let me just thank all of the panellists for their contributions, especially during this last hour. And then I'm going to call on Nicholas Thomas, who's going to do some wrap-up commentary. Is that right? Yes. Sorry, Chelsea.
Kia ora. I am going to speak, I promise, for less than 10 minutes. I wanted to begin by stating the obvious. The histories that are behind the histories that we've discussed have involved racism, exclusion, dispossession, some moments of mutual generosity, some moments of cross-cultural curiosity, some belated redress, some measure of reconciliation in the present. Those histories obviously have painful and divisive legacies. So I think it is all the more remarkable, and I want to celebrate the extent to which these discussions have been marked by so much mutual respect, generosity, and humour.